In a crowded Harrington courtroom, a white officer slapped a black woman, no questions, no hesitation. But he didn't know she was Judge Naomi West. That single act would shake an entire justice system. Before we begin, subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video because some truths can't stay hidden anymore. In a crowded Harrington courtroom, the morning noise had barely subsided when Sergeant Roy Talbot, a decorated white officer with a long record of unpunished grievances, slapped a woman across the face. He didn't ask her name. He didn't care. To him, she was just another black woman standing where she didn't belong. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that the woman he slapped wasn't a clerk, or a paralegal, or a passerby. She was Judge Eliza Rowe, and the moment his hand touched her cheek, the silent battle she'd been fighting for decades became public. For years, Eliza had walked through that courtroom enduring criticism, ignoring the stares, and staying silent as whispered power plays sought to undermine her authority. At 62, she was the first black woman to sit on Harrington's highest bench. And for some in that system, that fact alone was enough. But this morning something had changed. A moment of unchecked arrogance had broken through a wall that had stood for decades. A system built on fear had just hit something it could not shake. Eliza did not flinch. She looked Talbot straight in the eye and whispered, "Is this how you treat officers of the court, Sergeant?" The echo of that slap never really went away. It rippled through Harrington like a beacon, exposing the rot that lay deep within the walls of justice. Judge Eliza Rowe had never been naive about the system she served. But after Talbot's hand struck her in open court, the silence she had learned to survive was gone. That morning, after Sergeant Talbot had been arrested and Internal Affairs summoned, Eliza found herself alone in her chambers, staring at the faint red mark on her cheek. It wasn't the lingering pain, it was the humiliation. The audacity. The bitter confirmation that to men like Talbot, her robe meant nothing. Her years of service. Her sleepless nights reviewing cases, mentoring young black law students, and fighting for fairness meant nothing. And then the fallout happened. The video went viral. Social media exploded. Her inbox flooded, some messages supportive, others veiled threats. The local police union called it a misunderstanding. The Rower's office told her not to escalate. But Eliza couldn't stop now. Because when she reviewed the surveillance footage, what she saw chilled her to the bone. Talbot's expression after the slap, the way he looked at her like she didn't matter. The way the other officers didn't flinch. Like it wasn't the first time. Like it wouldn't be the last. So Eliza made a choice. She ordered a review of every case Sergeant Talbot had handled in the past 10 years. That's when the real fight began. In a matter of days, Eliza's office had become the nerve center of a system unraveling. Files came in. Sealed complaints. Lost footage. Plea deals that suddenly made no sense. A pattern emerged. Boone wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of something bigger. A machine built to protect itself. Her name had started popping up in internal memos years ago, not because she was involved, but because she'd been flagged. Too loud. Too principled. Too independent. Someone had been watching her long before Talbot raised his hand. And then, the envelope. No postmark. No return address. Inside a single photo. Her 10-year-old nephew cycling home from school. On the back, written in thick black ink, "Stay in your lane." Her hands went cold. That boy was her heart. Her sister's only child. Innocent, untouchable, or so she thought. She locked the room and called the U.S. Marshals. Her voice barely wavered as she demanded immediate federal protection. But inside, fear ran down her spine. Someone had crossed the line. And they weren't just talking. Agent Rosalind Frost from Internal Affairs returned with new evidence: a memo, locker room gossip, Talbot boasting about Judge Rowe, mocking her authority. Worse, a second voice, nameless, said that if Eliza went too far, she would be removed from office. It wasn't just a threat. It was a plot. Agent Frost leaned across the table. "This is beyond Talbot." Eliza nodded. "Then we are beyond Talbot." She had authorized the summons. Forced federal surveillance. Burned every favor she had ever had. And then, she issued the order that changed everything. "I want every case read. Every plea bargain reviewed. Every prosecutor cross-referenced." Her staff stared at her in stunned silence. "This will burn down half the courthouse," her longtime bailiff Blake warned. Eliza's voice was icy. Then let it burn. The attacks came quickly: smeared articles, anonymous tips to the press, old college photos falsified into scandal. A whisper campaign portraying her as an activist judge on a personal crusade. They weren't just trying to stop her. They were trying to erase her. But they underestimated one thing: Eliza kept records, notes, names. She pulled a black binder from the bottom drawer of her desk. Every doubt she'd ever put aside, every unpleasant judgment she'd been forced to accept. She handed it to Blake. "If they bury me," she said, "you bury them with this." He nodded once. "Please." Then the leak happened. An internal Justice Department report never intended to be made public named 12 individuals implicated in Talbot's misconduct. 7 officers, 2 prosecutors, a retired captain, and a sitting judge. Judge Howard Price, her mentor, the man who'd sworn her in, the man who told her she had a gift for the law and a heart that couldn't be bought. Eliza stared at his name for a long moment. "Ben," she whispered. Blake's jaw tightened. "He's part of it." Worse, he added, he signed 3 applications. When the moment came and Eliza released the list of names, the city changed. Harrington didn't erupt in flames. It simmered. Quiet threats turned into desperate actions. Eliza Rowe was no longer just a judge, she was a symbol. And symbols, when powerful enough, became targets. The morning after her press conference, Eliza stepped out of her home to find her car tires slashed, her security cameras disabled, the police assigned to her protection nowhere in sight. Agent Frost called in a federal team. "Someone's pulling strings," she said. "Inside your own department." Eliza didn't blink. "Then we pull harder." She knew she was being watched. Phones tapped. Computers hacked. So she started writing everything by hand. Notes hidden in books. Files duplicated and scattered across trusted hands: former clerks, old friends, a law professor in D.C. who owed her a favor. And still, the machine came after her. Emails appeared in court records suggesting Eliza had accepted bribes, completely fabricated but damaging. The State Ethics Board opened a review. Blake burst into her office with the news. "They're trying to end you." Eliza stood from her desk, quiet and unshaken. "Then let's give them something worth ending me for." That night she went to the source. Judge Price, the man who taught her how to hold a courtroom, now sat behind a high gate in a historic district, sipping scotch behind glass walls, watching Harrington crumble under a storm he helped create. He was alone. Of course he was. She didn't call first. She just showed up. "I knew you'd come," he said, answering the door in slippers and silence. "You always had too much heart for this job." Eliza stepped inside. "You always had too little." He didn't flinch. "You think tearing this down will fix it?" "No," she said, "but exposing it gives others a chance to build better." He poured another drink. Offered her nothing. "I warned you," Price said, "that going too far would cost you everything." Eliza leaned in. "And I'm warning you that protecting men like Talbot cost you more." Then she slid a folder across his table. The folder she slid across the table was thin, intentional inside, just enough to indict him. A signature on a concealed ruling. An audio file. The whisper of a promise made to a prosecutor who bent too easily. Price opened it. His hand trembled for just a second. "I'm giving you one chance," Eliza said. "Confess, cooperate, or I release the rest." He looked up. For the first time, there was no mentor in his eyes. Just an old man facing a legacy he could no longer defend. That move was the risk. Eliza knew it. She walked back to her car alone, no security detail, just her coat, her folder, and her resolve. Halfway down the block, headlights snapped on. A black sedan. No plates, no sound. Eliza kept walking calm. The sedan rolled beside her, slow, matching her pace. Then, from a dark alley, a second car pulled forward. She was being boxed in. Eliza's steps didn't quicken. Instead, she stepped into the shadows between 2 buildings. Her fingers gripped the old emergency stair rail of the courthouse annex, one she used as a young clerk years ago. She climbed it with surprising speed, ducked onto the roof, and disappeared into the darkness. The cars paused. Doors opened. But no one followed. By the time they reached the alley, she was gone. She reappeared hours later at the federal building. handing Agent Frost a new flash drive. "What's this?" Frost asked. "Everything," Eliza said. Price caved. "It's all their documents, recordings, names." Frost blinked. "How did you get him to talk?" Eliza stared at the floor, then said softly, "I reminded him of the young woman he once swore in, and the monster he helped create." 3 weeks later, the dominoes fell. Price resigned. 4 prosecutors were indicted. Talbot, in a final act of desperation, tried to retract his confession only to be hit with obstruction charges. But more than that, dozens of wrongly convicted defendants began receiving new trials. For the first time in years, Eliza stood on the steps of the courthouse not as a judge, not as a victim, but as a survivor who had turned her pain into purpose. The crowd gathered. Microphones poised. Cameras waiting. She spoke simply, "Justice is not just a courtroom verdict. It's what happens when the truth is allowed to breathe." She looked toward the crowd, locking eyes with a young black girl near the front, holding a homemade sign that read, "My future matters." Then Eliza smiled. "To everyone watching, listen carefully. Systems don't change until people demand it. Power doesn't shift unless someone is willing to risk something. So if you're waiting for a sign, for a hero, for the right time, let this be it." She turned toward the camera, her voice steady. "Subscribe to this channel if you believe truth still matters. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's next, because this fight is far from over. And share this story. Not just because it's powerful, but because someone out there needs to know they're not alone." She took a deep breath. "And to those in the shadows still watching me, I see you. But more importantly, now the world does too." The screen faded to black. Justice isn't loud, but when it echoes, it can shake the foundation. 1 week later, the Harrington courthouse felt different, not because of new signs or polished benches, but because of the air. Something invisible, something that had stood unshaken for decades, had finally cracked. Clerks walked a little softer, exchanged glances that held both reverence and caution. The whispers in the hallway no longer revolved around jokes or weekend plans, but around names: Boone, Allcraft, Eliza Rowe. People still weren't used to seeing her. Not because she had hidden, but because she walked in through the front doors, head held high, no hat, no bowing. Her scalp, still bare from the assault, was visible like a Eliza sign that pain was no longer something to hide. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't make public statements. She simply did her job, presiding, listening, writing. Her office had become a refuge for those who had once stayed silent. They came, former court staff, everyday citizens, even young judges, to share what they had seen but never dared to say. Eliza listened to all of them, recording every word without interruption. She wasn't just reclaiming justice for herself. She was clearing a path so buried voices could finally rise. And somewhere else, her name was spray painted in white on a red brick wall near the Central Market. Not as a saint, but as a warning. She didn't stay silent. So why should you? 1 month later, they called her the quiet flame. Not dazzling like a spotlight, but steady, persistent, and powerful enough to burn down an entire broken system. She never denied the title. But when asked about it in a rare interview, she simply smiled and said, "If my fire helps others ignite their own spark, that's enough." The Office of Federal Oversight expanded its investigation. Dozens of convictions involving Talbot and Allcraft were reopened. Some prosecutors quietly stepped down. Others were placed under review. And some, moved by Eliza's courtroom speech, filed official complaints for the first time in years. Eliza remained unchanged, arriving at court early, leaving late, and sometimes sipping herbal tea on the balcony with Blake, the quiet companion who had stood by her through the entire storm. One evening, as light rain tapped the railing, he asked, "Do you regret starting all this?" Eliza paused, then answered, "I only regret not doing it sooner." In the underfunded schools of North Harrington, a writing class was assigned the topic, "The most inspiring person in my life." More than half the students wrote about her, the woman with the bare head and the gaze that never looked down. One afternoon, after stepping out of court, Eliza was met by a middle-aged woman waiting by the gate. She didn't say a word. She simply held out a deep red wool scarf. "My mother knitted this. I think you need it more than I do." Eliza accepted it, and for the first time in weeks let herself cry, not from pain, but from knowing she had begun healing something bigger than herself. That night, in her small room lined with books, Eliza Rowe opened the notebook she once kept under her pillow back when she was a law intern. She turned to the last page and added a new line. The day justice learns to call our name isn't the day we win, it's the day we no longer have to scream to be heard. 3 months later, autumn had begun to touch Harrington with dry winds and a cold gray sky. The first leaves fell before the price of the federal courthouse, the place that had once witnessed a slap that changed an entire city. That courthouse was no longer a fortress of silent power. It had become a place where people came looking for hope. In her old chambers, Judge Eliza Rowe no longer sat behind the bench. She had taken an unpaid leave not out of pressure but by choice. A voluntary pause for herself, for justice, and for rebuilding what had been broken. Instead, she was now seen in places where once people couldn't meet her gaze: in municipal courts, at community forums on restorative justice, in local law schools, and sometimes at a small wooden table in the public library, helping underprivileged students draft scholarship essays for law programs. 3 months isn't a long time, but it was enough to sense a shift. Handwritten letters began arriving at Eliza's doorstep, not from the media, not from those who had once threatened her. These came from mothers, from young women, from people once wrongfully convicted. Each line read like a note in the symphony of justice she was quietly composing from the silence she had once endured. In another corner of the city, the Harrington Police Department was reeling under a storm of reform. 7 more officers were suspended pending investigation. A new program had just been passed, the Rowe Protocol, requiring all new officers to complete 40 hours of training on implicit bias, the ethics of power, and data transparency. It was a legacy Eliza had never named, but the people chose to name it for her. And there was one more thing. At a pivotal disciplinary hearing before the State Judicial Council, where they had once tried to remove Eliza from the bench for being too emotional, she said nothing. Instead, she submitted a short video. No narration, no music, no voiceover, just the moment she was slapped, the unwavering look on her face, and the image of her seated behind the bench, head freshly shaved, eyes unshaken. After that video played, the entire room stood up, not for the law, but for the woman. At the same time, a non-profit organization was founded, the Clarity Justice Initiative, launched by a group of young law students to support those forgotten by the system. Eliza accepted no honorary title. She simply attended the opening ceremony wearing civilian clothes, seated quietly in the back row. An older woman recognized her. They didn't speak. They simply held each other's hands tightly. 6 months later, Harrington was no longer a city of polite nods and silent courtrooms. 6 months after that fateful slap, every brick in its legal system had begun to shift slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Judge Eliza Rowe was no longer a name reserved only for courtrooms. Her story had been summoned before the National Judicial Reform Commission, a council formed in direct response to a nationwide wave of outrage, fueled by her case and others like it, finally brought into the light. In Washington, she didn't bring a lawyer. She didn't read from a prepared speech. She simply walked into the chamber, head held high, voice calm, and said, "Justice doesn't die in the dark. It dies in broad daylight when everyone sees but no one speaks." The room fell silent. When offered the position of chair of the Federal Judicial Oversight Council, Eliza paused. She said, "I'm not here to gain more power. I'm here to make sure power is no longer handed to the wrong hands." Still under public pressure and even the support of former critics, she agreed on one condition. She would personally select an independent investigative team, and she would have full authority to publish the ethics reviews of judges and senior officers nationwide. They agreed. A precedent with no equal. Back in Harrington, the Clarity Justice Initiative and in 3 more states. People who had once been wrongfully convicted were now being invited to train new police officers. Harrington Law School made Eliza's case a required part of their ethics and modern law curriculum. One Friday morning, Eliza returned to her alma mater to guest teach a special class. The young woman who once held the "My Future Matters" sign was now a final-year law student. She stood and said, "If it weren't for you, I'd probably still believe that silence was the only way to survive." Eliza smiled, nodded. Then she turned to the blackboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote 2 words: "Truth stays." That evening she returned to her old porch. No more alarm bells, no more anonymous letters. Just the wind, a pot of purple orchids, and a weathered wooden chair. She sat down, a cup of mint tea in hand. The sky didn't need a moon. It didn't need stars. It only needed stillness. Because sometimes justice doesn't need to speak. It only needs to be seen and no longer ignored. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.